Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing, as well as analysing, tech news which, as usual, has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. Hopefully, you're having an amazing day. I want to begin with an update to a story I covered yesterday concerning the Xbox Series X. If you're unfamiliar with the story, I'll give you the abridged version. A well-known Twitter user by the name of Kitty Corgi, they actually were very accurate with leaks for Nvidia's RTX 30 series. For example, they posted a tweet which claimed that some elements of the Xbox Series X's GPU were basically just RDNA 1. And some of this information seems to stem from a set of driver entries discovered by a Reddit user for Navi 21 Lite, which is what we believe is the Xbox Series X's GPU. And there were a ton of other driver entries which I've discussed ad nauseum at this point, so I won't go over those again. But the gist is that certain elements of the GPU did indeed seem to be rather different to what you would expect from the desktop implementation. The number of packer per SC, for example, was 2 rather than 4, which was more like what you would expect with Navi 10 and its brethren, so that would be Navi 14, for example, as well. So on the desktop, that would be like the RX 5700 series or the 5500 series. And yeah, this was further compounded by lack of knowledge of RDNA 2 in terms of kind of an in-depth drill down of the GPU architecture. There is definitely a lot of similarities between the compute units of RDNA 1 and RDNA 2, albeit with RDNA 2 featuring things like ray tracing functionality. However, because we don't have the desktop kind of die shots, and we don't have an understanding yet exactly how RDNA 2 for the desktop does differ from the slides that Microsoft have provided us from the Hot Chips conference and the white papers for RDNA 1, there is a lot of room for interpretation. Though I did say in yesterday's video I was going to do a little more digging, although I was fairly confident that what Microsoft had stated numerous times in public, as well as what we saw in these slides, was accurate, and that is that the console is based on RDNA 2, albeit with customization. Well, I reached out to a couple of my sources, and as more regular viewers will know, I have better sources for the PS5 as well as the kind of AMD desktop products. But I did manage to get a little information about what these claims were, and I was told that they are definitely not right. I won't read what I was told verbatim, because obviously it makes it a lot easier for leakers to be tracked down, because, you know, that's sometimes what companies do, is like analyze word choices and stuff like that. But I was told that RDNA 1, when it was being bought up, definitely did have missing features compared to what the original targets were. This is actually not new information. I've leaked before that I think variable rate shading was definitely one of the features that was on the cutting room floor, and AMD have mentioned in public that Zen 2 actually had some functionality which was originally designed for Zen 1. Basically, it just wasn't ready in time, and because of schedules, it was held back, and I was told exactly the same thing here. And it was kind of implied to me with this information that I've just been given that the architecture of RDNA 1 was not compatible really for the power envelope targets of a console. Again, I did somewhat go into this yesterday, that the performance increases in terms of IPC are great for RDNA 2 over RDNA 1, but it's also the power requirements too. Long story short, consoles have a very limited envelope in terms of how much power and heat that they can generate, or rather, how much power they can consume and heat they can generate. You cannot have a 500 watt console, it just wouldn't work. And while there is a lot of criticism for the PlayStation 5 and the size of it, it's mostly to do with the density of the chip And imagine if it was only RDNA 1 and they had to crank the clock frequencies up like that, it wouldn't work. Like, the chip literally would not be able to be clocked that high, which is why I think partly AMD did focus so much on performance per watt increases. Or more accurately, how AMD, how I'm being told anyway, describing this is power usage per CU. And originally, AMD seemed to have an internal target of about 50%, which was the same they had over the older GCN architecture, but now it seems to be actually slightly higher than that, almost 60%. So I believe that the Xbox Series X is fully RDNA 2, albeit with customization and snips and tucks as necessary for basically the size of the APU. I realise that we still are in the dark about a lot of stuff for the desktop, but I think that this is, to my mind anyway, pretty much settled. When we do get full block diagrams and kind of a breakdown and drill down of the fundamental differences on the CUs and stuff like that, we can start to do a much deeper analysis. But for now, I would say that no, Xbox Series X, unsurprising to pretty much anyone, is fully RDNA 2 compliant. I feel that people get really confused over RDNA 1, RDNA 2, and so on because they really associate them with a specific architecture rather than a malleable feature set. I really want you to instead think of them as more marketing slogans which have a variety of different features under them. And this feature set is very malleable, but the architecture itself, which underlies this, will differ depending on the implementation, i.e., the implementation of the desktop variant will be different compared to a console variant, and Sony and Microsoft can quite happily customize their GPU and still have a GPU which is based on RDNA 2, even if a feature or two is missing from their GPUs that is present in a desktop, and their implementation of RDNA 2 differs from one another. There are some elements, of course, some underlying design of the actual silicon which are uniform. For example, they see you having, let's say, ray tracing. That's a really simple one. And of course, the improvements to the performance on a per CU basis, lower power consumption, all of that stuff is definitely the same. However, there are also fundamental customization that Sony and Microsoft will have implemented, which is required for their specific design. But there's also certain functionality which is not needed for a console, but you better believe it's required for a desktop. I used this example yesterday, but let's, for the sake of argument, look at all of the graphics modes which you require to have support for on a PC, like VGA modes and all of this stuff. You do not need that on a console. It's that simple. There's also other legacy modes which are needed for backwards compatibility and all of this stuff on PC, which again you do not need. So basically speaking, just the act of removing those means it's no longer a full feature set of RDNA. Now I am definitely simplifying this just for sake of easy understanding, so I'm not being 100% technically accurate, but I am trying to get hopefully through to you that people really don't shouldn't really think of RDNA 1 and RDNA 2 as this like solid black box which you can never open. It is a set of features which you can change and customize. And one of the things which makes consoles so powerful and allows them to have any chance at all to compete with desktop is the fact that they do have custom solutions. And this also extends to the APIs as well, because ultimately, if you did not have custom implementation of hardware and things to be very tight and, let's say, well crafted and well honed, and you just use PC implementation of the hardware, the consoles would be very, very, very quickly outdated. For example, Sony have made various customizations to the geometry pipeline with the geometry engine on the PlayStation 5. This supersedes some of the elements of the desktop variant because Sony have customized it for their needs. But that doesn't mean that the PS5 doesn't have equivalent technology or perhaps better technology than the desktop. It just simply means that Sony have customized it. So, yeah, every single vendor customizes their architecture, and this is for a plethora of reasons. One is feature set needs, two is actual power requirements, space on the die itself. All of this stuff is well, just things that engineers actually have to worry about. It is not infinite space with unlimited budgets and all of this other, theoretical stuff. They have to worry about features which are going to be most important to developers and are going to pack the most punch, the most bang for buck for the smallest die space requirement. For example, variable rate shading, in the words of Microsoft when they were discussing it, it's a teensy amount of space on the die which is used to implement variable rate shading. But it gives a really large performance benefit. It could be 10, 20%, whatever, depending on the scene and how aggressive you want to be with VRS. The reason that Microsoft therefore made a decision is it's a no-brainer. When you incorporate VRS on RDNA 2, it's a no-brainer because the actual die cost, so you're getting a lot of bang for very little buck. And this is why variable rate shading and tech like it is so important on the PlayStation 5, the Xbox, and of course also the PC. I also would really like to discuss Cezanne and the rather impressive improvements that we have for Cezanne. Specifically, this is both the 5800U and the 5600Us, which are, APUs themselves. But the 5500U, strangely enough, features Zen 2, whereas the other processors, the 58 and the 5600Us, they feature Zen 3. This information does come to us via executable fix, and according to their info, we are looking at a 2.3 gigahertz base frequency and a boost frequency of 4.2 gigahertz. This is a 6-core processor with a TDP, which seems to be configurable from 10 to 25 watts, with 7 CU at 1.8 gigahertz. This processor is actually kind of nuts, and there is also something else to really kind of think of in the future too, and that is that DDR5 is becoming ratified in the industry. Now, I personally think that DDR5 is going to be kind of nuts, and there's actually an AMD employee on Twitter by the name of Park who actually does make a couple of really good points concerning DDR5. Um, Long story short, DDR4 obviously does have speeds which are kind of bonkers at the very top end, but most kits are not hitting, way over 4000 megahertz. According to Park, with the JDEC release, we are going to be seeing most likely DDR5 hitting 4800, which is providing in dual channel configurations 76.8 gigabytes per second. But eventually, the speeds will definitely increase substantially, possibly up to 8400, which would provide absolute bonkers amount of memory bandwidth, as Bits and Chips on Twitter states 134 gigabytes per second. Now, the reason that this is so interesting is because all of this will coincide by the time Zen 4 rolls around. And naturally, higher memory bandwidth is great for APUs because, well, the GPU is literally on the die itself. And when you're trying to power those things with DDR4, it just quite frequently is not enough bandwidth. It's literally limiting the performance that you can even have in the chip. Even if you had an infinitely sized die, which of course you can't, but let's just say you could, with infinite power and like heat constraints, which again you can't, but let's just say you could, if you cannot actually feed the CU, even if you had 7,000 CU on the chip, it doesn't matter because you literally cannot feed them enough data with DDR4 in a dual channel configuration. But with DDR5, especially as we start to kind of inch closer, we could conceivably have some very interesting configurations. And I believe this is one of the reasons that we're seeing AMD make some of the decisions they are for Infinity Cache and the architecture around it. I think that, yes, naturally it does help build cheaper GPUs, and we'll be discussing Navi 21 extensively in a moment. And that's great. GDR6 is much cheaper. You don't have to worry about really wide memory buses and all of that jazz. But it also gives you a very good indicator of what we could possibly achieve with DDR4 or even a slower DDR5 spec, especially given at that point we can assume that RDNA 3 or 4 will be out and Infinity Cache will have obviously evolved substantially. So I believe that that is pretty smart for AMD in terms of kind of a wider plan. In fact, I was told that the 256-bit 14 Gbps was equivalent of maybe even a 384-bit bus, which is obviously substantially wider. The only thing I wasn't certain of with that information is if that was with the same clock frequency memory, so 14 Gbps, or whether that would faster, so 16 or 17. But let's say worst case scenario, it's the same clock frequency in the memory. You can still imagine how this would benefit an RDNA 2 based APU, but particularly an RDNA 3 based APU with DDR5. And now I want to finish the video with Navi 21 stuff, because by golly, we have a lot of information for this. As of the time I'm recording this, we will fully understand what AMD have done with the architecture, at least to have a pretty good understanding in 10 days from now. As I said, I think that there will still be some things under embargo, and that will not be lifted until reviews, but AMD will probably at least give us a good understanding of what SKUs they're working on, release schedules, pricing, and naturally, perhaps the most important for many of you, performance. But there have been a couple of updates. The first is from Patrick on Twitter. They actually leak quite a lot of stuff. And Navi 21 XT apparently has 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory with a TGP, so total graphics power, of 255 watts. And at game clock frequencies, it can hit 2.4 gigahertz. But wait, there's more. We also have a tweet from Rogame. And there are at least two variants of Navi 21 Silicon which we have clock frequencies for. AMD appear to still be retaining the base, game, and boost clock. So I'm just going to say base, then game, and then boost, but obviously they're each of the clocks. So the base frequency is 1400 megahertz. This is for the XL. 1900 megahertz for the game clock, and possibly up to 2200 megahertz for the boost. XT, which is the highest end SKU, 1500 megahertz, 2100 megahertz, and the boost does have a bit of variance. It seems like it's 2200 to 2400 megahertz. And again, to go back to some of my previous leaks, what I was told for Navi 21 is that it does overclock fairly well. There is a lot of headroom. I've mentioned this a couple of times now, but AMD seem to be quite content to leave it down to AIBs. Now, I'm unsure why that is. I kind of had the impression it was so that AMD could basically advertise the fact that they have lower power consumption, so it's kind of like a best of both worlds, and then obviously AIBs can crank the frequencies as they so desire. But it also might simply be for silicon, yield reasons, like that. I'm just giving an example here, but let's say that 2 in every 5 XT dies hit 2400 megahertz, then obviously that's down to AIBs to kind of figure out their lineup. Another possibility as well is that AMD are trying to incentivize AIBs to basically back them. One of the issues that AIBs are really running into with NVIDIA products at the moment is NVIDIA have a pretty good grip on what AIBs can do to customize the cards. And that does have some positives as well as negatives, depending on your perspective, which is a whole thing. But yeah, I definitely think that there is a ton of flexibility here. And there is definitely a much higher clock frequency. And I still think it's absolutely baffling. I don't understand how people are still skeptical of the performance of RX 6000. I have said for a long time, like with pretty much all of my leaks, that AMD will compete with Nvidia. AMD will be competing very well with Nvidia. I just don't think they're going to crush Nvidia. I don't think they're going to dominate Nvidia. I don't think they're going to, decimate Nvidia's lineup. I think that it is going to be on a game-by-game basis, and there is definitely a lot of reason to purchase Nvidia, which could be hardware-based ray tracing. I still am hearing that Nvidia are going to be ahead on that, but of course there are a lot of other reasons. You might say, well, I want to use Nvidia's, Nvidia Broadcast, for example. Will AMD have an equivalent? We don't know. Maybe, though, you prefer AMD's drivers. Maybe you prefer X or Y. So again, a lot of this is going to come down to personal preference. My point isn't whether, the personal preference thing. My point is that in terms of raw performance for traditional rasterization, AMD will be extremely impressive for the next generation. And it's not difficult. This is not rocket science to understand. Because all you need to do is make the rough assumption that AMD's engineers are not incompetent, which you would assume not, given what they're achieving with Zen and all of the other stuff. And you can make the assumption that if the Infinity Cache is being used, it is not a massive detriment to the performance. Again, you would assume not. And then you can simply say, well, golly gosh, the RX 5700 and 5700 XT performed like this. If you roughly double the number of compute units, it's going to perform like this. And even if you do not account for extra IPC gains for the RDNA 2 architecture, let's say that you want to be ultra pessimistic, super duper pessimistic, and say, you know what, Infinity Cache is going to be detrimental. I don't think AMD's schedulers are going to be so great, so I think all of this IPC gains per CU, it's probably going to be countered by, other limitations of the architecture. Even if you want to say that, you can then literally look at the clock frequencies here, and again, even if you want to be ultra pessimistic of the clock frequencies, and say there's no way that AMD will hit 2400 megahertz, which I am pretty confident they will, but let's just be ultra pessimistic and say they will not do that. They will hit 2200 megahertz or 2100 megahertz. There is absolutely no way in hell that you can come to the conclusion that they will only be slightly faster than an RTX 2080 Ti. I mean, maybe the only way that it would be roughly the same speed as an RTX 2080 Ti is if you took both of the cards, you flew up in a helicopter about 20,000 feet or whatever the maximum ceiling is from a helicopter, and you dropped both of them with similar levels of wind resistance. Maybe then they would be about equivalent in speed as they were hurtling towards Earth at terminal velocity. But in general, they will not be the same speed as an RTX 2080 Ti. It is literally impossible. You would have to have actually regressed in IPC so ridiculously that it would have been a catastrophic the set of decisions in terms of engineering, and I don't believe this is the case. The consoles are a really good indicator that AMD are not screwing around. The PS5 is hitting 2230 megahertz for an APU which is absolutely titchy. It is tiny, and that is an APU, 36 compute units. An Xbox Series X is hitting 1825 megahertz with 52 CU running, and the Series X, according to temperature tests which have been done, and I haven't really covered these extensively since official tests have been done because, quite frankly, I'm sick of talking about console temperatures. The console's actually running cooler than the Xbox One X, And that's despite the fact that we have other components like Zen 2 processors, which are hitting much higher clock frequencies. So yeah, it's really baffling to me that people are thinking that the the RX 6000 series is going to be bad. I'm personally loving the RTX 3080 card. I absolutely love it. I think that the performance is amazing. So this is not me crapping on Nvidia. I think Nvidia's products this time around are stellar. I think that they learnt a lot from the 2000 series. And I really wish that we'd have seen this level of performance in ray tracing in particular at launch for the 2000 series. I think that it would have been very interesting to see how the market reacted. However, yeah, I'm very confident in all my leaks now for the RDNA 2 cards, and I think that we're going to see a really nice set of options for gamers. And ultimately, that's what I hope for. My only major complaint at the moment, well, it's not really a complaint, I guess concern, is that AMD are the only game in town, assuming that their claims for performance for Zen 3 are not drastically overblown, for CPUs. Intel are definitely going to be getting pounded in gaming performance, in my opinion. And I feel that's a real shame. I know some people love it when AMD beat Intel and all of that, but personally, I don't. I like to see really tight competition. I would like to see, like we saw in the heyday of Intel and AMD, like both rabbit punching one another, and we saw that's when we saw like the Athlons and Athlon 64s really come to the market, and I think that that's really good for competition and pricing. I think that Rocket Lake, I think Rocket Lake will be pretty good, but I think it's really going to be down to Alder Lake from Intel, and goodness knows how AMD will be responding, because I don't think Zen 4 is going to, I don't think Zen 4 is going to suck. And I think that's just about it for this particular video. There's also links in the video description, so if you want to follow us on Twitter, well, feel free. And there's also a link to our Patreon, so if you do want to donate $1 a month, that is, of course, greatly appreciated. I do very rarely shout that out, so thanks to everyone who does support us on Patreon. Naturally, even if you don't want to contribute or you cannot afford to contribute, just sharing the video and kind of liking the video and watching our content is absolutely amazing, and I highly appreciate it. But with all of that said, thanks very much. Have an amazing day. Take care. Bye for now.